So, Toure, you successfully straddle this sort of unique space where you are able to be the pop contributor and everyone turns to you when the latest, greatest, or some extrapolation comes out to take an analysis of things that we all enjoy, but you also have a serious voice in political commentary.
That hasn't been particularly hard. I mean, there was a time when I was at MSNBC when I was like, they think of me as the pop culture guy, so I need to make sure that they understand that I'm serious. But for the most part, it's not a problem. I think a lot of people can have a broad array.
There's a path.
Yes, that you can do both.
Do you think that permeability is becoming more apparent now, or since people are so siloed in politics, especially when there seems to be such a divide, that those walls are going back up?
I know for me, I get super excited about really interesting new music, movies, books, television shows, what have you. And I'm super engaged and passionate about what's going on in the political process. And I don't see why I should not be able to speak about both of them. There's a value to depth, and I understand music in a fairly deep way, even though I'm not a player. So I can use that. You know, so when I want to do a book about Prince, people know, like, you know, he's going to be good at that. But, you know, the next book I'm working on is totally different. It's about infidelity.
Before intersectionality was a hashtag, you had some really succinct thoughts about how criminal justice and the war on drugs specifically helped to influence Black culture and particularly hip-hop culture.
You know, hip-hop is inherently political. So growing up, loving hip-hop and writing about hip-hop, it's easy to move over to talking about full-on politics. But, I mean, yeah, I mean, I feel like, you know, hip-hop started out sort of having a position against drugs in the community, right? And the war on drugs. And you hear some of the early records, drugs are not mentioned all the time, right? They're mentioned less than you would think for a moment when the crack epidemic was so huge. And they're almost always mentioned in negative ways. And then you get to the 90s and things shift and people start referring to it differently. And then you start to see the rise of the drug dealer rapper. At this point in hip-hop, you can't be on the top level of MC without having been a drug dealer, which is kind of crazy that we kind of swallowed it. They were like, you want a monster? Well, I'll be the monster. I'll show you the monster. I mean, I think it's partly, you know, the constraining of professional opportunities, but also just us saying, I'll be your monster. And so we have certain people, you know, who are caking up on portraying the monster, when at the same time, the war on drugs is the biggest problem that Black Americans have right now, more than the drugs themselves. The war on drugs is the problem, but some of us are embracing being part of that ecosystem, which is troubling. Even as I love Jay-Z and Nas and, you know, Rick Ross sometimes, but still it's like, it's troubling the way that you guys have embraced that and we have embraced that from you.
So can I quote Toure to Toure?
If you want.
Okay, go with me on this one. This fight would not only shape the Black community, but also molds hip-hop, a music and a culture whose undercurrent remains Black male anger at a nation that declared young Black men monsters and abandoned them, killing any chance they had at the American dream. Now, this was post-Blackness of Obama where you wrote this. So I wondered if you think your lens has changed on this post-Blackness after the Obama administration, and more importantly, in this context, post-truth in this whole time of Trump.
With hip-hop, I was just surprised, I remain surprised that hip-hop did not become a place of resistance against the war on drugs and drugs. It embraced those things. The notion of post-Blackness, I think, sort of sits a little bit differently, and for me, which has nothing to do with post-racialism, right? And post-racial is a meaningless term that, you know, we all know is completely bankrupt. Post-Blackness drives toward the idea that there are an infinite number of ways to perform or embody blackness, where you can be black in any way. So that tyranny of you're not black enough because you're not from the hood and you're not doing this and you're not acting like the brother in the final part of Moonlight, that like he's black and the rest of us are not. Like, no, that's ridiculous. There are many, many ways to perform blackness. Hip hop, in particular, is not showing us a variety of blacknesses. It has a very narrow vision of blackness. It does not. Does it include us? Does it include someone like Obama? I mean, like, they mention him, but before he was president, did it include him? Does their vision include Patrisse Cullors or Kamala Harris or Issa Rae? I mean, I think a lot of times, no. There's a very narrow vision. There was a time when you had a little bit more of that, we'll call it alternative Negro sort of thing in hip hop, but that has faded away for the most part. And I would love to see a broader vision of blackness and just life in general coming out of hip hop.
The piece you wrote in Playboy about the legacy of the Central Park Five took on a whole new light when the person who championed every horrible thing that could have possibly happened to those brothers is now sitting in the Oval Office. So looking back at that piece and where we are now and what it means in the context of criminal justice, where are we?
Well, we're definitely going backwards in terms of criminal justice. I mean, you know, we had reached an understanding that with the Obama Holder era that the police are making a lot of mistakes. They need to be reformed. You know, there were a lot of consent decrees where we're going to deal with these police departments and figure out what's going on. You know, and just sort of Black Lives Matter was embraced. Right. And now we are going in the opposite direction. We have a pro-police Department of Justice that will probably not care about the rights of black and brown people at all. We're going in completely in the wrong direction. We need fewer people in prison, right? We need fewer people being arrested. The notion that prison solves the problem is completely wrong. You know, and it's interesting because a lot of people agree with us that prison is not the answer and yet are still perpetuating that mechanism. Our car got robbed a couple of months ago. My wife, actually tomorrow, she's going to go testify. She didn't see the robber, right? But the police are like, well, he's the guy. Yeah. And she was saying to the district attorney, like, I really don't want to do it because I don't believe that prison is helpful. And it is criminogenic. Prison makes you more of a criminal. So he's working the machinery of the criminal justice system, even as he's going, this is not working. And, you know, I would love to ask him, have you seen a situation where somebody goes to prison and then they are better? Yeah, they're rehabilitated, they're reformed. Does that have does it ever have a positive impact on somebody's life to send them to prison? I would argue almost never, and it generally make their lives worse. We focus mainly on using or holding marijuana based on the notion that our drug policy is based on the notion that if somebody comes into contact with a drug, they will become an addict and their life will be ruined, so we must prevent their access to drugs. Okay, so that logic makes no sense, and it doesn't deal with the fact that we have millions and millions of productive drug users, right? There's no, in the language, in the discussion, there's no differentiation between drug users and drug abusers. The abusers, they stand in for all the users, but there are millions of doctors, lawyers, other sorts of professionals who, parents who smoke a little weed at the end of the day, you know, it mellows them out, you know, maybe the beginning of the day, you know, and they are productive Americans. They should not be demonized with the broad brush of like all drugs are bad always, all the time. So
knowing full well that this is America's longest running war, if we harken back to when it was declared up until this moment where we're sitting here right now.
I mean, you know, we can easily acquire drugs almost anywhere at a solid price. The price has not gone up that much, so I'm told, over the last 20, 30 years. The potency is the same. I mean, like, we've accomplished nothing with the war on drugs, and we have criminalized many, many people. If you, I mean, when you go into prison, you are cut off from normal society, right? It becomes very hard to maintain those bonds with your family, with law-abiding people. So we are cutting them off, putting them around a bunch of criminals, right? Constricting their lifelong job opportunities. Yeah. We're creating criminals. Should we be creating criminals out of people who chose to put something in their own body? Mm-hmm. I would say no. If you drive a car when you are stoned, that should be a crime, right? If you get into a fight, you know, and commit a violent act when you are stoned, that's a crime. And that's already a crime, by the way. Right. But being stoned or having marijuana in and of itself, these should not be crimes. Why are we penalizing this? The reason why we're penalizing this, of course, is because at the end of, you have to read Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari. When Prohibition was coming to an end, Harry Anslinger and his department said, damn, man, Prohibition is going to end our agency. And then what are we going to do? And government agencies fight to stay alive just like human beings do. Absolutely. So they said, let's switch to drugs. Before that, you could get cocaine. You could get heroin in a normal, what they would call a drug, they would call it a drugstore, but we would call it like a pharmacy. Society was much more open. Yeah, yeah. And we understood people can use these drugs carefully for themselves. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to become monsters.
So do you think that this war on drugs and its wholesale effect on communities of color in general and just the nation as a particular is the criminal justice issue of our time?
I think this is the issue of our time. I mean, especially for Black Americans, this is the biggest problem. It reinforces the wealth gap by cutting millions of people off from their families and the above-ground economy. It reinforces the police as an oppressive force rather than a force to bring safety to communities. You know, it demonizes and criminalizes us as people. I mean, like, you know, you can't take, you know, a couple million young Black men or young men out of any community, throw them in jail for a couple of years, you'll never work in the above-ground economy generation after generation, and think you're not going to have a massive national problem come out of that. And that's what we've done. And you know, we have a police force that is in an oppressive occupational posture. The notion of bad apples, a couple of cops are bad, we need to wreck that notion in our collective mind because that is not the problem. The problem is the systemic racism that posits, that places police officers in these positions to oppress and occupy the community when we all know if you really want to police drugs, you can also do that in white communities. You could do that in colleges, right? The desire for drugs goes back centuries. It exists in animals as well. We need to legalize it, right? Let the government take over the distribution of the drugs so you have dispensaries, these sort of things. Only that would kill the underground market. We cannot, as we've seen from the failed 50-year-old, 45-year-old war on drugs, you cannot kill the drug supply through some sort of war on drugs. It's ridiculous. And it's failed.